Jack. Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
So today we've got Caleb Caudell on the show. Caleb's an author from, is it Indiana?
Yeah,
Is
Indianapolis.
Right? Indianapolis. In the United States. Recently published a novel called Hardly Working. Would you call it a novel?
I've been toying with the idea of calling it a novel. I think you can call anything you want a novel. The categories and the labeling are running amok. Less novelistic works have been called novels, shorter books. And I wanted to have a little fun with the categorization, and that's why there's that subheading or title of semi-autofiction, which is also a little bit of a mockery of the autofiction label.
But you've published, I think, a more conventional novel. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, it's called The Neighbor,
Neighbor,
and then a collection of short stories as well. And then Hardly Working is novelistic, but it's more autobiographical. But even The Neighbor has autobiographical elements. It is somewhat derived from actual observation and experience of my time living in a particular neighborhood in Indianapolis. And that time is also featured pretty heavily in Hardly Working, but a little bit more directly pulled from what I've experienced.
And this is just sort of an aside. So these are published by Bonfire Books. I think they're based on Nicholson Street in North Carlton, which is really close to where I grew up. So
right, the
shout out to
Aussies.
Bonfire Books.
Yeah, it's an interesting connection, and I'm extremely pleased with what they've done for me. They've been very easy to work with. They let me do what I want, but still offer useful guidance, and they're prompt, they're responsive. They publish efficiently. I don't have to wait 2 years to even hear back from them on whether or not they even want to do anything. It's an ideal situation for me because I'm pretty impatient with things like that.
It's also maybe you wrote a really clean manuscript, but shout out to the editor who worked with you as well. It's a really clean work, which so in more independent literature, I'm quite tolerant of typos or some funny formatting if someone's doing it, particularly if they're doing it as a side project or they're not paying an editor or something like that. But it's just so nice to have an edition which is so clean.
Yeah. Well, I insist on that. That's a personal standard, and I have to give credit to my publishers. It's two guys pretty much, and there is no separate editor. There's no one with that specific role. But I work with one of them in particular. We go back and forth on the manuscript. The one, Lucas, he had a lot of helpful advice on arranging the pieces and providing structure, giving it more coherence. But most of the editing work is done by me, and most of it was done prior to even submitting. And then I went through draft after draft. I cleaned it up as much as possible. I think I have a fairly keen editorial eye anyway, and I've done some editing work for other people, and I try to be as meticulous as possible. And I get upset when I notice errors, and I'm intolerant of silly mistakes, and so I try not to let anything like that slip through. And that's how, if I were submitting anything to anyone, if I were making a bid for one of the big five, like a deal of that sort, I would treat it the same way. I would try to make it as clean and as professional as possible.
But it's certainly something I really, really appreciated. Look, I wouldn't necessarily recommend a book to someone saying, look, there are just no spelling errors, you're going to love it. But it's definitely a plus.
Yeah, for sure.
Is there anything else before we get going that you want to introduce, any work of yours that you want to advertise? I think shilling is morally and spiritually very beneficial.
Yeah, I'm trying to get more and more comfortable with it because I have some deeper aversion to it. There's something distasteful about it to me, but I'm trying to accept the necessity of it.
Hmm.
And the only other shilling I would do is directing attention to the other two books that I've published with Bonfire, The Neighbor, which is a more traditional novel, and then Novelty and Other Stories, which is a short story collection. And I've noticed that short stories, despite what many people would think, it's hard to get people interested in short story collections. I don't know why exactly that is. You would think with short attention spans and people being distracted and having a book that you can dip in and out of easily would be appealing, but short story collections don't typically garner the same hype or interest, especially prior to a release. I noticed way more attention for a debut novel than a follow-up, a short story collection.
That is quite surprising, and I've heard something similar and was also quite surprised for similar reasons to you. With shortened attention spans, you would think 12 brief pieces would just be more marketable
Right.
in crude terms. I wonder how much of it is a prestige thing, so people can't say I've read X novel and advertise that. If we're,
Yeah.
I don't know, depending on how despairing you want to be.
Well, no, I think that's a solid point because it doesn't, you don't feel as accomplished saying, oh, I read that short story collection, even though it can be just as, if not more demanding of your attention or critical faculties. But novels almost recommend themselves more automatically. They seem more impressive both to write and to read, even though, of course, it's much more complicated than that. But superficially, at least, yeah, I think you feel a little bit more accomplished saying either I read or wrote a novel as opposed to a short story collection. And maybe going a little bit deeper, short stories might actually demand even more attention. A 400-page novel, your attention levels can wax and wane, and you can retain a general sense of what's going on. There's more leeway in a bigger novel to miss details but still follow the thread. But with a short story, you're getting it or you're not. You have to bring all of your focus to bear, or it's fruitless.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I guess with most novels, it will leave aside something written by Thomas Pynchon, which it just seems designed to fuck you up, on every page. But most novels which aren't written somewhat maliciously with the reader in mind, probably the attentional load is highest at the start, and then you acclimatize.
Yeah.
Even if they've got an odd writing style, you get used to it. Whereas yet with short stories, especially I find if you're reading someone who's very good at the form. I read Nabokov's Dozen recently, and he's remarkable at just being able to throw the reader with every single one of the short stories, and you're forced to jump in again, learn everything again, get up to speed. And then oftentimes it's a frequently used technique because it's effective, it's good. When a short story starts very suddenly, shakes you up, and then ends as soon as you feel like you're getting your feet, which I guess could be, or is, exhausting over a long enough period.
Well, and Nabokov's a good example too. He is challenging as a novelist and a short story writer. The language is very intricate, and you have to read carefully. And he's deliberately playing tricks on you throughout. And there are different levels of enjoyment. You can still enjoy the surface of the language without understanding all of the puzzles and the playfulness of it, but it does reward deeper focus as well.
Deeper focus and also fluently speaking English, French, and Russian. He's got a pretty high bar to get everything there is to get out of his work.
Some of the multilingual puns are often beyond me, and I have to accept that, but there's still plenty that I get from it.
Yeah. So, actually, in terms of shilling, I do want to draw listeners' attention to your Substack, Middle American Fiction, which is really, really good. And I find your style, which is your writing style, is quite spare, very direct, and I find it works really nicely. Um, I don't mean this in a derisive way at all. It works really nicely on the internet. It's just really to the point,
Yes.
straight ahead.
Right.
You get the full effect immediately. It doesn't creep up on you
Hmm.
in quite the same way. So I normally don't like fiction much on Substack for whatever reason. It just doesn't gel with me, even though I love fiction otherwise. But
Yeah.
your Substack, Middle American Fiction, it'll be in the show notes for listeners, is really good. It really works.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. And I do write the way that I do deliberately. I write that way on purpose. I want to be direct. Of course, I don't want to be simplistic or reductive, but part of it is an attempt to counter the sheer quantity of material on the internet, especially at a place like Substack, where there's an incredible range of voices and also quality as well. There are some they're highly skilled writers, and there are people who, at the very least, you could say they are more amateurish, or they're just having fun, they're blowing off some steam, they're enjoying themselves, but maybe it's not really, it's not at a high level, it's not polished. And even people who have more intricate thoughts oftentimes are extremely tangential, and there's a lot of prefacing and padding and preemptive asides. My tolerance is very low. I'm very impatient. Maybe I'm more extreme than many, but if I click on something and I see someone who's just explaining what they're going to do, I'm probably going to tune out. I'm probably going to X out of that, because it's not even so much that I technically don't have time for it. It's that I already don't trust this person to do what they're telling me they're going to do, because they're trying to tell me ahead of time what they're doing. Why don't you just do it? And if it's good, if it's effective, then I'll be able to get into it.
Yeah, if it feels a bit high school essay in the introduction, in this essay I'm going to X.
Yeah,
Whereas,
there's a lot of that.
yeah, whereas for example your short story Novelty, I'm pretty sure I read that one on your Substack.
Yeah.
It basically within less than a paragraph, you know what's going on. You're there. You're in this. I wouldn't call it a dying relationship, but a relationship that's stillborn.
It's lackluster. It is crawling along, and at least one of them is looking for a way out. And I think that's also very much true to life and typical. I'm not saying that that's what everyone is trapped in, but I think it's also extremely relatable and easily observed.
In terms of your prose style, have you always written in this very direct, I wouldn't call it completely spare, but it's not a particularly ornamental style. But have you always written in this way, or did you said that you're consciously trying to do that? So do you always have to force yourself to write this way? Is there a more elaborate style that comes more naturally to you?
No, this is more natural, but I am also always refining it. And I am very much committed to always improving and figuring out ways to refine the style, the voice, but also experiment as well. I wouldn't say that I'm going to deny myself certain things if I become interested in them, just to stay perfectly consistent with one idea of a voice or a brand. But I'm fairly easily negatively motivated in a number of different ways. One, say, with slight aside, with physical fitness, for instance, I can easily motivate myself by seeing examples of people who don't take care of themselves. And then I think, I can't be like that. I need to go to the gym. Similarly, with very sloppy, mistake-ridden, tangential prose, I will read something like that and think, okay, how do I make sure I don't sound like that? I do not want to sound this boring and self-involved and inflated and dull.
Fair enough. It's the equivalent of walking into the gym and seeing someone with 9% body fat smashing out 250 kilo deadlifts for reps.
Yeah, well,
So it's too good. You think, well, why the fuck am I doing this? I'm just going to go home.
But no, I'd like being punchy. I appreciate that in other writers, which again is not to say that I want to sacrifice all complexity or depth in a style or a treatment of a subject, but I do go for I try to cultivate a visceral quality, something that is gripping, that of course you can either be interested in or not, but it shouldn't feel like homework. It shouldn't feel like you have to trudge through something that's thorny and colorless.
So what I'm hearing is you're planning in the future to get rid of all adjectives, adverbs, possibly even verbs, just a pure succession of nouns. Just whittle everything away.
I'm not quite. I'm not quite of the Hemingway school either. There, I don't think. I don't want to be quite that extreme either. I think because that can be mannered in a way that also ends up feeling very artificial and stifled. So I'm trying to find at least some balance there.
Yeah, it's really, I guess it goes for any extreme of prose. It's very easy to get wrong, and the more extreme you're getting, the less leeway you're giving yourself. Because similarly, you can have extremely elaborate prose that can work very, very well. It's just really easy to get that wrong.
Oh yeah,
you're
that's
a razor's edge.
Yeah, and I think you're probably more likely to get that wrong than the slightly more terse or laconic style. I think that the risk with being laconic is that you're just a little bit boring.
Yeah.
But then, that's about it. You're probably not going to just confuse people or put them off that way. But the more elaborate, the more complex you become, you need more and more control over language. You need, because I've seen this in myself too, especially as I've developed and worked on things, but you see it among more inexperienced writers who you can tell very much who they're reading right now, and it's someone who has a more elaborate style and they're copying it, and you can tell what they're going for, but they just don't have the command of language. The words are flying around, syntax is slipping, the sense is wavering.
I guess it's very easy for that to become quite confused. So an advantage of, for example, your style, this much more constrained style, is, I want to emphasize to listeners, boring and monotonous are not synonymous, because your style, at least in Hardly Working, there's a certain monotony to it. And I don't mean that as in boring, but it's got a slightly dampened affect, which is thematically very, very appropriate. Like it works very nicely. And the more moving parts you bring into something, just the more space there is for dissonance.
Yeah.
In terms of making that atmosphere.
Right. And I am also easily offended by clashing imagery and language. Especially if you go for metaphors and you string them along and they are inconsistent with each other, that is extremely distasteful to me. And so I try to make sure that I don't do that. And a slightly simpler style makes it less likely that you're going to do that. And also, thematically, it's very appropriate because I'm not talking about moving in aristocratic circles and attending cocktail parties. And I'm not talking about these sophisticated intrigues among privileged people who have nothing better to do with their time but scheme and undermine each other. I'm talking about working class life, working class conditions, talking about surroundings and conditions that are a little bit grittier and a little bit more straightforward, at least on the surface. So maybe it could work, but it would be a little bit more of a stretch to write like Henry James or Proust about working in a Walmart freezer among men who are probably functionally illiterate.
Mm. That sounds like it could be really, really interesting, but
It could be.
very easy to screw up. Like
Yeah.
the space you're leaving yourself to work in there is pretty small.
Yeah.
So you've already said this is a work of semi-auto fiction, and I think I said this too before we started recording, but I've never read any auto fiction, whether of the semi-auto or full auto variety. And so I don't have that many reference points here in terms of similar books, similar authors. So what were your points of reference for writing this book? Are there any authors that have particularly influenced you? You mentioned Emile Cioran in this.
Yeah.
I guess at least in terms of the pessimism, that's somewhat opposite, but otherwise it
Yeah.
didn't feel like a work of his.
No, the early influences, they do include Cioran and also more philosophical than literary, but or the figures who blend the two, like Cioran and Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. In my late teens and early 20s, I really got into philosophers like that. And
That's the
I
time for
think
it.
that's still the aphoristic style, but also the pessimism or the nihilism, or at least the exploration or analysis of nihilism, not necessarily the endorsement of it. Although with Cioran, it does seem to be a little bit more of an
The problem with
endorsement
being
there.
born.
Yeah, that those were strong influences. The term autofiction, to me, it's something that I almost use more ironically than sincerely, because I think that it is a label that is now thrown around mostly pejoratively to describe a very specific kind of work, which doesn't cover the whole field of what could qualify as autofiction. And for example, I mentioned him just a moment ago, but Proust is, if we're being strict about it, that is autofiction. This is a multi-volume, massive work, which is, for the most part, his life and experience, with only names changed. It's directly what he experienced, filtered through a literary style, but it's his life. He is the narrator. It's what he observed. It's what he thought. It's the people he knew in his life, with names changed. That is autofiction. But no one ever calls it that, because what most people have in mind when they talk about autofiction, it's almost always used to dismiss a contemporary style of flattened, clipped, quotidian writing that's usually coming from a more affluent class. And you can make the case that all fiction, no matter how fantastical, is still, it's autobiographical. There are personal details, there are elements that make their way through that. But I don't see why there's so much of a preoccupation with, oh, everything that's coming out now is autofiction. It's all these MFA grads, it's credentialed people, it's coastal elites, and they're writing about what these drained conflicts or these vague anxieties and issues that they're having. I wanted to call what I was doing autofiction just because it is autobiographical, but I'd like to think it has a little bit more verve or life to it. And another little tagline that we were thinking of, my publisher and I were thinking of, was putting the bio back in autofiction. Because I think what most people object to, because it is this critical term, I think what most people object to with what's called autofiction is not so much the auto part or the self-absorption of it, but it's the lifelessness of the prose or the voice.
Yeah, and I guess that makes sense. So when I read this, I thought, oh, I don't really see what the problem people have with autofiction is. But if this work is also not completely representative of autofiction, however vaguely defined that may
Yeah.
be, then maybe my intuitions on that aren't quite Right. It is interesting thinking about then what distinguishes autobiography from autofiction. If it is just sort of errata, like, I kept the people's names the same,
Yeah.
and this is what makes it autobiographical versus autofiction. If the fictional component is really as little as, well, I changed some proper nouns around.
Right. Well, I mean,
Mm.
these questions are part of why I consider some of this to be a little bit specious or worthy of some kind of ironic send up in a way,
Mm.
because
Mm.
I would even say, yeah, you've got strict autobiography, right, where someone sits down and they say intentionally, I'm writing the story of my life, everything is as close to what I experienced as possible. And then there's autofiction where it is the life, but just with names or locations changed. But then going down the line farther, you could make the argument that, well, take someone like Joseph Conrad or Herman Melville. They writing about these seafaring
Mm.
adventures. Well, they were on ships.
Yeah.
These are fictional stories, but obviously, so much of what they're talking about is based on the lives they lived. Is that so? There are auto-fictional elements in that as well.
Yeah, which makes you run into that write what you know dictum. If autofiction is in some way bad, but you should write what you know. I guess what you quickly realize is a lot of these dicta are kind of specious was a good term. It's
Yeah, well, it's
yeah.
all so much of that is horseshit. I don't put much stock in any of that kind of advice, and advice is way out of proportion now anyway. But I
Mm.
think that is characteristic of the internet and that rapid fire transmission of information. But it's not so much write what you know; it's write what you're good at writing. So
Mm.
whatever that is, if you're good at writing exactly what's happening to you on a daily basis, that's what you should be writing. If
Mm.
you're good at
Mm.
writing about some sort of political conflict on the moon, then write about that.
Mm. Just pornographic Warhammer 40k fan fiction just
Yeah,
happens
well,
to be
if
your wheelhouse.
if that's what you're good at doing, yeah, it's like write what you know. No, write what you are capable of writing well. I mean, who
Yeah.
gives a shit otherwise?
Mm. That makes me wonder, actually, back to what you were saying earlier about autofiction. I wonder if part of what makes it currently more popular than autobiography is that the authorial voice allows you a bit of an out. If you're saying something that's
Hmm.
personally embarrassing, you've got that exit route of being able to say, well, this is the fictional part. The part that embarrasses me is the fictional bit.
Yeah,
All the other bits, that's real.
right.
Whereas when you're writing autobiography, you're committing, and in some ways, it probably just depends on temperament, but you might be more constrained in talking about certain things that cast you in a bad light or might be embarrassing, might
Hmm.
be unacceptable in certain social circles of yours.
Yeah, no, I think that is part of the appeal. Although I do also think that comes down to temperament and
Mm.
how willing you are to expose your real self versus a fictionalized version. But even there, you don't really have much cover anymore because the way many people read now, I mean, people are not saying everyone, but that this has become a little bit more prevalent. People are increasingly unable to distinguish author and character, even in much
Mm.
more
Mm.
obviously
Mm. Mm.
fictional works. So you don't necessarily have a whole lot of a defense there as far as putting things out to the general public.
Yeah, it's hard to judge whether Lolita would be harder to publish today or when when was it published? Was it published in the 50s?
Yes, I don't know the exact year, but it was the 50s.
Mm.
Yeah. And has always been controversial, but these things always it fluctuates and it's really difficult to pin down exactly what the moral standard is, and it depends on what group you're talking about too,
Mm.
because it seems as if you look at things a certain way, you look at certain segments of the population, what the age gap relationships are verboten, but then
Mm.
if it's the right two identities, then it's actually encouraged, and people need to be
Mhm.
educated on child sexuality. And there are all these inconsistencies that are difficult to sort through. But yeah, with Lolita, still what we've got an educated white man who's writing about a preteen
Mm-hmm.
girl, so that's probably still anathema. And
Mm-hmm.
it's just
Mm.
one of those stupid things that pops up every now and then, right? Where you see someone say, "This book is monstrous, disgusting. Anyone who likes it, that's a red flag. That's reprehensible." But a lot of that's just noise.
Yeah, it's hard to say because obviously I've never lived at any time but my own, so I'm not really in a particularly good position to say whether that literalism in reading, that that lack of separation of characters and author is more acute now than it has been in the past or not. But I do notice that, and it is irritating. It feels quite constraining.
Yeah, right. Well, there have been various standards
Mm,
throughout time, right? And people have had to work around censorship. And there are obvious examples of that. Ulysses got into trouble, D.H. Lawrence, Lady Chatterley's lover.
hmm
Sexually explicit content has not been easy to publish for that long. And more recently, it has become easier, but even there, it's still, you have all of these finer distinctions of what's acceptable and what's not. And some things have become much more acceptable, but then there's almost a necessary vacuum filling where or a whack-a-mole effect where when one thing is deemed permissible, something else then has to be prohibited.
mm, mm. In some ways, too, probably having it. I'm not sure whether taboos are really escapable in society. It feels like there's always
No.
going to be something that pops up that you're not allowed to do
Yeah,
for terms.
yeah. And
I
you
also think
can,
it'd probably kill art in many ways. You need some sort of charged subject to, if not directly address, then at least come close to get some of that heat. And
yeah.
probably be terrible for the artistic world in general if we suddenly became completely unconstrained.
Yeah, I think too much encouragement can be a bad thing. Too much support can actually deaden an artistic pursuit.
Mm,
It can certainly dull your senses. I think you can sharpen your skills and your thinking by working around certain constraints and keeping obstacles in mind and finding workarounds. But just endless support and encouragement and accolades, that is not necessarily a good thing.
mm. So in terms of this question of authorial voice, with hardly working, did you find yourself feeling constrained at any time writing about certain things in this book? Because there are parts of this book that, for example, I would feel embarrassed about writing about. There's particularly the chapter which is exploring, at least in part, the relationship of human beings to technology and to technics through the
Yeah.
metaphor, or probably not a metaphor, of a penile implant
hmm
and an extended discussion of erectile dysfunction.
Yeah. Well, you might think, yes, that that would be extremely embarrassing, difficult to admit, that I would want to veil that more. But part of it is that I'm assuming from the outset that no matter what, I'm simply not going to receive that much attention for it. First
Mm,
of all, I'm not going on the Today Show. Maybe I would that would give me a little bit more pause. Maybe I wouldn't be quite so eager to share these details. And also there's something about discussing these things as a man that is also less likely to attract much attention. The confessional mode is not it doesn't have that much power in in that domain specifically. People don't really care about these issues for men because some of it's embarrassment, some of it's just lack of knowledge, but also there's probably an evolutionary component to it as well. Not that I'm the biggest Evo Psych guy, but I think there is something in people's brains. I think there's a part of our wiring that doesn't exactly make us all that interested in hearing sad stories about struggling male sexuality. I mean, if anything, it tends to upset people.
Or be an object of ridicule.
Yeah, or
Which
ridicule.
which is actually that was sort of the direction I was expecting the story to go in. And
Mhm.
then I was very pleasantly surprised when it turned into a discussion basically of it was almost like the technological society as explained
Yeah.
using a penile implant. I thought,
Well,
oh, I didn't expect this.
well,
This is
that's
good.
I wanted to take it in that direction because I didn't want to just dwell on the purely personal side of things. And
Hmm.
I wanted to strike a very delicate balance where obviously I am talking about personal things and there is an intimacy in admitting some of this, but I'm also not overly fond of those really syrupy memoirs where it's just I was abused and I
Hmm.
went to jail and there's this whether it's intentional or not, it's likely to elicit strong pity responses. I did not want to be pitied. I was not seeking that kind of condolence or compassion, but I still wanted to I wanted to bring something to awareness and then use it to make larger points that are actually much broader and more applicable to the way people live in general and have been living for a while.
Hmm.
So I was
Hmm.
trying to maintain that balance.
Yeah, and that I feel like that's part of the secret sauce that stops this book becoming dull or boring because given how bare the prose is, how quotidian a lot of the subject matter is, it would be easy to make it dull. But it's particularly how you'll take quotidian subjects, or say the the existential terror of working in the service industry,
Yeah.
or like screwing up a carpentry job, or your heating going out in a piece of shit apartment that you're struggling to pay for. Using those things as a jumping off point to talking about atomization, menial labor, impotent rage, domestication, sex without reproduction, public spaces without interaction, transient drug elevated states, this sterile hedonic anesthesia. That was what I felt was a really load bearing part of this book, keeping it interesting.
Right. Yeah. And the quotidian pieces, they provide a counterbalance from that direction as well. Because if it's all not that you couldn't write about this effectively, but if I also didn't want to do a book of pure theory or
Mm,
sociological commentary either. And I really wanted to blend the two together as seamlessly as possible so that you're never going on too long with, oh, I had a sandwich and then my toilet stopped working and then I got fired. If it's just that for 300 pages, yeah, maybe you're going to tune out. But then if it's also
mm.
just 300 pages of by these historical processes, average incomes or testosterone levels have declined. If it's just that for, I really wanted to work it all in together so that you were in one phase for just long enough at a time.
A book of dialectical testosterone materialism could be fun, but
Yeah, it could be. I personally would probably still like that, but I didn't necessarily want to, yeah, write that
yeah, look,
book.
I would probably buy and read that, but I don't know how big the addressable market is for that sort of
Yeah.
thing.
Hmm.
I would look. I'd probably still have you on the show, but
Yeah, no, and maybe who knows how long this goes on? Maybe I'll end up doing something like that, but just for my own amusement, if nothing else.
mm, mm, mm. In terms of structuring this book, so you mentioned that you had help from the team at Bonfire Books in terms of how to arrange these pieces.
Hmm.
What? So it seems roughly chronological, or is it just straight chronological?
It is
The order of these
mostly
pieces.
there might be a few minor discrepancies, but they are small, and it spans about a 7 year period total. And there are some gaps, but originally there was way more material, and the original manuscript that I submitted, it was still fairly polished on the line level, but it was messier with the sheer quantity. And there was more repetition too, because
Mm.
much of the material I had written, at least when I wrote it, it was disconnected. So I'm writing short pieces over a period of years. So what
Mm.
happens, maybe not for everyone, but at least with me, there were repetitions because I was treating each piece as a self-contained entity. So it would be fine to repeat something that I had said maybe 6 months ago, because now it's people are only experiencing this essay. They really have no connection. It's not as if they've read one thing to the next continuously. But then when we put it all together, some of those repetitions were a little bit more jarring, so we had to smooth that out. And yeah, it was much more a matter of just cutting out excess. It wasn't so
Mm.
much rearranging pieces in time, because there was a fairly built-in chronology, but the real work was in identifying, and we kept some of the repetitions in because thematically it worked, but identifying the really excessive ones where it just became ponderous or seemed, you can have these intentional repetitions, but sometimes you have to make a decision where, okay, even if I do intend it, this seems like I'm just slipping up and I've forgotten what I already said, so we don't want the appearance of that either.
Mm. And what is it about certain events in your life that compels you to include them in a story rather than others? Because there's a definite focus on, say, workplace events, and I feel like more in the probably the first half or maybe first third of the story, relationship events that seem less prominent later on.
Yeah, that work to me is a constant, and it's just such a fertile source of
Mm,
material, at
mm,
least. And it's almost the only, maybe even selfishly or in an immature sense, it provides some consolation, at least to me, because I get so little out of the labor itself that I can
mm,
somewhat justify it to myself, and it's always there, and I can always pull something from it. And usually the work that I do is it involves the public, and so there's also plenty of opportunities for observing how
mhm,
people behave and what's current in speech patterns and valuations. So it's an incredibly rich source of observational material. And then with relationships, that's something that earlier on when I was writing about daily life, I included more automatically or unconsciously, just by virtue of needing to pull from whatever was close by. And then the more I wrote and the more I read of what other people were doing, I mostly wanted to protect, in a certain sense, actual people in my life.
mm,
And it's one thing for me to say things that are potentially very embarrassing or shameful or upsetting, but the more I wrote and the more I put online, the more I thought, okay, I can still write about my general condition. I can write about the workplace. I can write about people in the abstract, but I don't want to actually write about intimate partners and expose them that way. So I started to shy away from that. And it's not as if, I guess, yeah, between us on the podcast, it's not as if I now no longer have any sort of love life or intimate relationships, but I just don't want them out there the same way I am.
What in in the case of specifically your relationships, my assumption reading was he's probably just found a long-term partner, and this part of his life is not causing as much mental stress, and so he's just not as inspired to write about it.
There is that. I mean, that's an accurate assessment there. It's partially that it's not as stressful anymore, or maybe interesting, but
Mm,
also that, yeah, I don't want to be including, especially if it's going to be fairly banal. I don't want to be including, oh, my girlfriend and I went to the farmer's market and we had a good time buying raw milk or something.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
not only is it more tedious, it's also, yeah, I just am not as comfortable bringing other people into that medium.
Mm, mm, mm.
I mean, it's one thing if like I mentioned, I wrote a Substack recently about going to New York City, and I mentioned a girlfriend, but I don't go into detail on who she is, and I mentioned some friends, but I don't dissect their personalities or anything. It's really not the point.
It sounds like a much more mature approach to
Yeah, I'm trying to.
personal
Once
relationships.
again,
Right?
this is well, maybe it is a nice diagram of something of a maturation process because I don't think I had quite the same handle. And it's not, of course, I was still a fully grown man. I started doing this when I was around 29, 30 years old or so. So you can say what you want about stunted maturity and
It's about
delayed.
the end of adolescence.
Yeah, delayed development. But I think earlier on, I was a little bit more just drunk on the expressive practice itself. So it was, oh, she did this to me. I'm going to say this. I'm going to, yeah, I'm not nearly as inclined to do things like that now.
Look, if you're focusing on work, then that's a never-ending source of
Yeah.
observations because it has. Look, I'm not nearly historically aware enough to know to what extent it was the case in previous ages, but it does feel like a more bourgeois phenomenon where your work is quite almost ontological. Like you are of this particular job. This job in some way reflects something very essential about your person rather than, well, I do it to stay alive. Like I do it so I can get food and I don't really give a shit about it otherwise.
Yeah. Well, there are fewer sources of identity now, and that is a product of a much larger historical process which is economic and political and sociological, of stripping away all of these more anchored sources of identity of your community, your familial belonging, national identity, all these, and it gets narrowed down into what do you do to make money and what status have you achieved? And it's difficult to distance yourself from that. Gen X did popularize, and it doesn't start with Gen X, but that ironic distance, it's always been attempted as well of, oh, you work this job, but then really you're this other person. But even with that ironic posture, it's very difficult not to feel consumed by what you do for a living because it's such a strong and obvious identifier, and it is very much an American custom to inquire very early on when you're getting to know someone, what do you do? How do you make a living? What is your status?
That's the same in Australia.
Yeah, well,
that was immediately recognizable.
Yeah,
Australian culture is basically America with maybe a 6-month lag now. It keeps getting shorter because of telecommunications technology.
Right. Yeah. So we've all been swallowed up in this grinding economic machine or this process where you have to make a living, and then not only do you have to do that, but, and this is one of the things I talk about in the book, it's not enough to find a way to make a living. You have to inject your personality into it. You have to project who you are, and you have to identify with all of these different facets of it. And that can actually be, some people seem to thrive in those conditions, or at least apparently they do. They're putting on the show that they do.
I don't believe them.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't either.
Someone must, only an absolute psychopath would be deeply spiritually fulfilled by making frappuccinos to order. I would absolutely not trust that sort of person.
No, but even a few steps down from that, there are people who are more enthusiastic than I am about, say, craft lattes or craft cocktails or food culture. And unfortunately, it's something I've been able to do more so because it's easy to get in and out of, but I am truly not passionate about food and drinks, and I quickly grow disgusted by the obsession and the excessive interest in all of these refinements of food and drink. There's something repulsive about it to me, but I'm right in the middle of it every day.
Yeah. So how much of that disgust is of a piece with something that comes up very frequently in this book, this I don't think you say it explicitly, but it it's very much there. The prevalence of surrogate activities, and those surrogate activities can be, say, going to the gym, and a few
Mm.
times, say, you or the narrator or the protagonist, however you want to describe the person narrating in this book, whether you'd call them Caleb or not, say has a breakup or something, goes to the gym, ego lifts for a while to just get themselves tired, or there's sterile surrogate sex. So sterile in a very, very literal sense. It's not for reproduction. It's just kind of for this anesthetic hedonism. Surrogate relationships, everyone's always ready to move on. There's no commitment. Or surrogate consumption of food, really. Like, it's not for sustenance. It's for this idle play. It's for the fulfillment of eating rather than eating to any sort of goal beyond that. Is that part of the disgust?
Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah, because that is rampant, and you can identify it in a number of domains. And there's a little bit of a Ted Kaczynski thing going on there, because in industrial society, that's what he is able to observe, is that industrial society is full of surrogate activities, because this vast apparatus has been built up in a way that, yes, it provides convenience and comfort, but at the same time, it deprives you of a sense of genuine autonomy, and then it leaves you with a need to somehow to feel powerful or in control, and all you have are these replacement pursuits and experiences. And there's also a shade of Welbeck in there too, where he even ties, he not only can you say that both sex and eating are surrogate activities, but he makes the point in a couple of different places that food becomes a surrogate for sex, and that when you push sexual liberation far enough, that actually induces weariness and disgust, and it also creates this heightened competitive landscape that pushes many people out of the field altogether. So for the people who have grown weary and disgusted by the pursuit of sex, and the people who have been cut out of the competition, they actually have food as their replacement. And so they gorge on pastries to fulfill those unfulfilled needs.
So, do you have a feel for what sort of process it is driving this? So this atomization, this removal of, I guess, more meaningful activities or non-surrogate activities. So, for example, I've read enough Nick Land or Jacques Ellul to have, I guess, instinctive feelings as to what it is. But what do you think's pushing this?
Well, my instinct is that there's no one single driver, and it's not a unified or organized conspiracy necessarily. Although maybe I just haven't looked deeply enough into it, because that style of thinking has never had much appeal to me. I know it's out there. I could dive into that more, but historically, a good place to start, I think, and maybe this is moving things back too far. Maybe this can be a little grandiose, but
No, go grandiose.
The modern revolution, the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, modernity broadly conceived, where as far as the exact date you put it, that can shift around a little bit, but post-Renaissance, Descartes, Francis Bacon, scientific revolution, the idea that we're going to develop a method, a science that will improve man's estate. And this is a break with the ancient way of thought, which is also throwing so many different strands in together. But if we can characterize ancient thought as a certain acceptance of limits in relation to higher powers, right? You've got man who is mortal and terrestrial, and he has certain abilities, but he is ultimately limited by his mortality and by the power of the gods above and below him. The modern break looks at this and says, actually, we're in a position to become gods ourselves. And you can get into the fibers of how intentional this was. Were they really thinking that they were going to usurp divine power, or was it more practical? Was it a little bit more down to earth? Were they disguising some of their aims just to avoid censorship and even punishment or execution by the authorities? But yeah, in the modern period, the idea is we're on the precipice of being able to change nature and engineer it according to our wishes and interests. And there is, it's probably worth saying, there's some positive. It's not a wholly malevolent or satanic enterprise. You look at human suffering and you look at our vulnerability and you look at the historical record up to that point, it makes sense why you might say, hey, maybe we can develop some tools that will actually make life easier for ourselves. But once that gets started, and there's no guarantee that that was going to work out effectively at all, just maybe we don't actually have the understanding to develop these instruments. And also maybe the authorities do crush all attempts to do so, but it happened to work out that enough people were able to invent, and money was invested, and enterprise was developed, and improvements were made. But along with those improvements, you have all of these possibly unintended effects or byproducts of that, which is populations explode, more people are kept alive, there's less of a natural check on human biomass, and the more people there are, the more commerce, which increases goods, services, the potential for travel. But then with that, also the separation, the atomization, all of these things, they compound, they build, they form feedback loops. With some of the effects are positive, many of them are negative, but I think it builds up to a certain momentum and becomes unstoppable. And there's no single entity or organization that is in a position to steer things one way or the other.
Yeah, it's that interesting momentum of, I guess, say you've got Descartes' God through to Kant's God through to Nietzsche kind of foreseeing where this is going, where Protestantism through to atheism, him seeing where that was probably going, and then you arrive at now.
Yeah, and depending on how academic you want to be, it might be tedious for some people, but you can even go back to the Middle Age, the conflict in the Middle Ages between the Thomism and nominalism, and the scholastics versus the nominalists, and the idea that God is either reasonable and good, and we human beings can understand him analogically, that we are reasonable animals, we are animals of reason. We have the capacity to, at least by analogy, understand God and conform to his design and order, versus the nominalist idea that God's will is beyond human understanding, and we are either saved or damned according to his will. And from there you have Luther and Protestantism, and once you have God's will prioritized over God's goodness and understanding, then you're a short step from just cutting out the God part, and then you have human will. And with human will, it's what can we do? And once you are there, what can we do takes precedence over what should we do. Is it possible for us to do this? Let's do it then. That becomes the imperative.
You pretty quickly get to, if not pure mechanism, then getting close to pure mechanism.
And only it's mechanism backed by will of increasing power.
Yeah, and we did come up with certain technologies, like, for example, the social technology of capital, which allows communication. If you commodify goods and services, it actually allows remarkable communication between things that previously couldn't communicate.
Right.
And this ordering of human life in a non-human or just a completely supra-personal way, that it might have happened to an extent before, but not as quickly or as deeply as it's happening now.
No, it certainly accelerates all of these processes. And another thing to remember is that the idea of commerce is in part not just to increase the goods and services and the luxuries, but it was very much thought of as a means of curbing violent impulses or conflict
Mm,
over
mm,
religious belief as well. And that's
mm.
another thing that liberalism doesn't get much credit for anymore. It's easy to forget that the idea of a liberal government or a liberal social order was not based on a completely frivolous idea of people doing whatever they want all the time, but was somewhat devised as a reaction to brutal, bloody, religious civil war in Europe in the
Mm,
early modern period. Someone like Hobbes is instrumental in
mm, mm.
formulating this idea of a liberal government because the time in which he lived was racked by horrific civil and religious conflict. And so he was in a position to take these problems extremely seriously and say, all right, how do we reduce the chances of people killing each other over their beliefs? Okay, here's what we do. We push commerce and actually promote fear and vulnerability and
Mm,
say,
mm.
really what defines you is your capacity to be tortured and murdered, and you don't want that. So how are we all going to get along? Let's focus on these material things, these improvements we can make on commerce and staying out of each other's way when it comes to beliefs.
Yeah, that concept of the secular does really seem to be so. This is obviously very reductive, but in part the search for a quote unquote neutral third party who can basically tell Protestants and Catholics what to do, or to give them some sort
Hmm.
of forum within which to work out their problems without the violence of Europe in the 1500s.
Right. Yeah, it's let's come up with a mechanism. Let's come up with a government, some sort of power that is beyond the sects, the warring tribes or groups, and that there is some sense in that. There's a sensible line in being in the midst of those kinds of conflicts and then wanting some respite or wanting some protection from that.
Do you think that opening up of a space between groups of intense belonging, so say your intense belonging in, say, Catholic Europe or Protestant Europe, opening a secular space which at least formally doesn't belong to either of those groups of belongings, is that part of the lineage leading to what you're talking about in hardly working of this just complete atomization, people not
Yes.
belonging anywhere, floating around?
Right. Well, no, that is the line, and that's what makes everything so difficult because you can see how at one point in history it made sense or it was actually practical to try to
Mm,
create that
mm,
space or drive some sort of wedge or a disconnect between these different groups of believers and how they belong to different groups. But then as that continues to progress, then you reach a stage where people are not only, it's not so much that they're free to separate their beliefs from their economic activities or their social status or their place in society. They're incapable of any longer merging those spheres or feeling any kind of coherence or cohesion among
mm.
those different parts.
In that sort of environment, what would it mean to belong somewhere in a more meaningful sense than, say, going to a reading, doing ketamine with some people you know from the internet, and then waking up the next day and, I don't know, like working at a bike shop or something?
Yeah, I don't know. I think you'd have to start very modestly and very small scale, very locally, probably with, if you have actual family relations, you have to
Hmm.
start there. And you have to accept certain discomforts or tensions because these are not intentional communities. These are
Mm.
people that, in a certain sense, you can play this almost verbal game of, well, it's an accident that I happen to be the son of this particular man. And woman, but it is still a fact that I am, and so we're not necessarily going to share all the same interests, but there's an underlying bond there, which in reality is stronger than shared interests, especially as those interests concern things like consumption of art or cultural identifiers or signifiers. So you have to really sober up, because what I've seen is that what many people do is they have some sense that, oh, they need to belong to something, they need to be a part of something, but they try to do it in this very intentional way, which still reflects their personalized, narrow interests and preoccupations of, oh, I'm going to be part of this political community, or people who share my exact beliefs in this way. And I don't think that's going to actually work out well most of the time, because if all you have that bringing you together is a shared artistic tastes or even political values or even religious beliefs, if that's it, the potential for disagreement and discord is very strong. And then there's nothing else. Once you start to disagree on some doctrinal note, what do you have? Well, you're not from the same place. You don't share blood. You don't share anything else. So really, you have to work the other way around and say, okay, these are the people that I have stronger ties to. It's location, it's blood, it's history, maybe, but then that should be strong enough to weather disagreements over, oh, do you think this person is intelligent or not? Or do you believe this group of people should be able to do this or that? It has to go in that direction.
Yeah, basing things around, I guess this is maybe a consequence of the Enlightenment, basing things around what you feel to be rational, which oftentimes turns into, reason is the slave of the passions, often just turns into your animal instinct. It's so fissile.
Right.
And over enough time, the probability of you disagreeing with someone gets close to 1, or is effectively 1.
If you talk enough. Well, that's another problem with emphasizing discourse, even supposedly rational discourse. So let's argue back and forth. Let's talk. Let's air out every single thing that we think. There's a danger in that. That's an extremely volatile thing to promote. Communication doesn't necessarily aid understanding. It often foments disagreement.
Yeah, it sounds sort of like a Hallmark card, or it'd be sort of a strange Hallmark card to receive, but a parallel universe Hallmark card where you have to accept that people are going to disagree with you on things, and it's actually okay.
Yeah.
You'll be fine if someone, especially if a stranger over the internet disagrees with you, but even closer to home, so if your parents disagree with you on something, particularly on politics, it's probably actually in your best interests to shut up, listen to them, and try to keep the peace.
You probably should.
A very good thing to practice.
You shouldn't push that. And imagine having this lineage. You've got generation after generation of people who have worked and sacrificed to provide for the next generation, and you're the latest in that line. And now you are prepared to cut those people out of your life and then to join a very unstable group that is also likely to cut you off the moment you no longer align with their shifting interests. Is that really? I'm not saying now. Some families, I guess the qualification to be totally comprehensive. Some families, some local situations are truly abusive and repressive in a way that's not at all conducive to any kind of human flourishing. And there are specific cases where it makes sense. It's reasonable to want to disconnect from that history or that background. But in many cases, there's way too much of a rush to do that, and it's not very well thought through.
Yeah, it does seem so that the solution to a lack of durable community that is sort of sadly common really does seem to be doubling down on the factors that make present communities so fissile anyway. It's basing them on things that are very changeable. So
yeah,
if say you now and you 5 years in the future just agree on everything, then you're probably a fucking vegetable. Like you're actually
Yeah.
just not paying attention at all.
Right. And yeah, why would you want to try to join something that is only derived from something you discovered about yourself in the last 10 minutes or so? If I just found out I have this sexual identity, I'm going to go be with a bunch of other people who also have just are experimenting with these things. How really is that? How cohesive, how durable is that going to be? What are you expecting there? And most of the time when people engage in this sort of thing, there's a tacit assumption or expectation that these larger scale social, economic, governmental forces will support them as well. And that's also part of what feeds into the expansion of these various bureaucratic functionary organizations as well. It's like the more distance you have, the more isolated you are from these more rooted or organic communities and bonds, the more dependent you are then on state functions and powers.
So do you think the current discomfort, because there does seem to be quite widespread dissatisfaction with something or a constellation of somethings relating to a lack of community and an isolated existence, an atomized existence. Do you think that we're just going through an adjustment period and people are discomforted because of that? And at some point in the future, these forces might eventually congeal into something that people are comfortable with? Or is this something which is actually just inimical to human happiness?
Yeah, unless there is, I think the only way that people will adjust comfortably is if there is an effective means of re-engineering the body and soul. And I'm talking materially, technically, through bioengineering. And if there are enough people who are at this transitional point who, rather than say we should find some other way to find some sort of happiness, but no, how about just put chips in my brain or intervene into change the genetic code so that I'm like a mountain lion who's fine with just hanging out on a rock and eating every couple of days, and I don't need other people, and I don't need these historically grounded roles or identities. I think that's the only way to do it. The only way to crush the human spirit fully is through a totalitarian technological control system.
Yeah, understanding the soul is an engineering problem.
Yeah, right. Well, if people are not happy with the conditions we've given them, all right, we'll just tweak this part of the prefrontal cortex or change the amygdala. We'll change the hormonal profile. Oh, men don't like what's going on. Well, we'll give them more estrogen. I don't know. Not that I know all the particulars of that, but that would be the only way to do it. I think in a way that completely blots out even the memory of how things were or the idea of how things could be otherwise.
That sounds so repulsive.
No, I know it is, but there's a small percentage of people who that makes them giddy. The possibility of that.
Look, I have sympathy for the excitement of how far can we push our power. It's just I feel like in almost a Titanic sense, you're unleashing Titanic forces that you can't necessarily control. It feels like there's going to be a lot of unintended consequences there.
Well, that's the gamble of that modern project. That's what's so audacious about it is, all right, there's this potential now to harness all of this incredible power, but there's no way we can foresee in advance everything that's going to follow from that.
So I guess this has all been sort of a jumping. We used hardly working as a jumping off point into these things, but for listeners, hardly working does deal with a lot of this stuff, and it's quite often a funny book, or at least I found parts of it quite funny, although it does hew negative. Why do you think art tends to explore these more negative aspects of life? Because there seems to be a strongly negative valence towards things that we really, really value. artistically. I
Yeah.
can't think of many like extremely optimistic novels, apart from ones that are making fun of that sort of optimism, like Candide.
Yeah. Well, the baseline materialist or evolutionary explanation is that our brains are geared towards identifying, noticing, patterning threats, potentially disruptive forces for the
Mm,
sake of survival and advancement.
mm,
And even if we engineer an environment that is supposedly safer, more comfortable, and even more supportive of our various efforts, we're still always on the lookout for what is negative, disruptive, painful, potentially upsetting, whatever's on the horizon that's looming and threatening. It feeds into our perceptive apparatus much more
mm.
smoothly and at a much higher volume. And even religiously, there's this. It's a long stand. Even optimistic religions, even religions that offer something hopeful in the end. That's all. That's always after setting the stage in a very
Yeah, after the
bleak.
Veil of Tears.
Yeah, it's. I think it's just an inescapable aspect of our psychology is that even
Mm,
our optimism has to be founded on a withering assessment of how things are.
mm. Because there is, in some sense, something very perverse about finding a story about a shithead student butchering two women and then finding absolution in the lap of a prostitute in Siberia, like in Crime and
Yes.
Punishment. There's something very perverse about reading that and being deeply emotionally moved.
But then just run it, reverse engineer that where what if Raskolnikov, he starts out, he's brooding, he's wondering what he has the real potential to do. He wonders if the law applies to him, and then he contemplates this great transgression. And then he decides against it and says, "Yo, you know what? I'm just gonna believe in God and hope for the best." And it doesn't even sound like a story,
Mm,
right? It's just, I mean, maybe you could turn it into something dramatic still. You could depict the inner struggle or the conflict between doing the right or wrong thing. But no, him actually, the story of him murdering his landlord and then the other woman who
just
happens
happened to be
upon
there.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the trying, wrestling with the guilt and realizing that he is perhaps in quite a bit of danger. He's going to be punished, but also he's beholden to a higher power as well. It's just so much more powerful. It's so much more compelling than someone who maybe thinks about a conflict for a second, but does the right thing because the world
Mm,
is actually pretty easy to navigate. It's,
hmm.
yeah, it's a little bit brutal in a sense, but it's not a super sophisticated explanation. But yeah, it's the complexity and darkness of that is just so much more captivating.
Yeah, it's almost you have to get burned to really learn. Like
Yeah,
he's not going to realize the innate goodness of the punishment he's receiving
right.
without
Yeah,
transgressing.
but that's why redemption is so incredibly powerful. The idea of the structure of it, and it makes no sense without some kind of transgressive act, without being lost, without being plunged in darkness, without at least undergoing a moment or a period of destitution, desolation, hopelessness. These are all integral experiences.
Mm. So, in terms of the future of your writing, so you've just published Hardly Working. Do you have any projects currently underway, or are you really focusing on promoting Hardly Working? You said earlier you're trying to improve at
Yeah.
promoting it.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how much more I have in the tank on that. I would probably do another podcast or two, but then I would like to back off a little bit on that and
Mhm.
not worry so much about promotion. And not only do I not want to annoy other people, I don't want to annoy myself. And I'm always on the verge of annoying myself by sticking my face into the public and saying, "Hey, this is what I'm doing. Everybody pay attention to it." So I probably don't have a whole lot of that left in me coming up. But I'm always
Mm.
I'm always writing, and I've got a couple of projects in mind. One, which is even more experimental in a sense, or maybe even solipsistic. I've been writing in a series of notebooks. I don't know how many pages this would translate into printed work, but I was thinking of calling it isolation. I don't know what I'll end up calling it. Kind of in the vein of a Knut Hamsun style, like Hunger. I like those one-word titles sometimes, but maybe isolation. It is the one voice of a completely isolated man who's reflecting on his past and also the current decrepitude of his social life, being completely cut off from everyone. But it's almost Proust or Thomas Bernhard style, a flowing, uninterrupted, streaming monologue. And it will still be somewhat mercifully short. It's probably not even going to be 150 pages, maybe even shorter, maybe novella length. But caustic, funny, scathing, but then with moments of tenderness, and then possibly a purely internal redemption arc. There's a very dry running joke, which almost might not even sound like a joke, where this character comes back to the idea that he needs to call a friend that he's estranged from, and he maps out how he's going to do this, and he's preparing himself to call a friend, but he never does it. He gets distracted by his own thoughts and then is off thinking about something else, and then occasionally also reminds himself that he needs to start working again. It's never explained what he's doing for money or how he's living in his apartment, but soon he's going to go back to work. But there are just these occasional references to getting back into a normal life, but it doesn't happen. There's that, and I don't know, that might be too self-indulgent, but I've had a lot of fun writing it because I don't know. That was a great opportunity. Also, another thing that I enjoyed about what I've been writing here is this person is not an artist, and so they're actually very contemptuous of artists, and so I've been able to vent all of my own contempt for writers and artists because I have a lot of that as well. And it's not just some pathetic self-loathing thing. It really is just the way artists are, which is often extremely obnoxious. But oftentimes when you have works like this where it's just one guy thinking or writing, he is self-consciously an artist as well and is trying to valorize art, if nothing else. But I wanted to push it even farther and make this character someone who also dismisses art and thinks that it's this grandiose, pompous waste of time, because sometimes I do think that, and especially depending on what I see. But apart from that, I don't know. I'd like to turn that into a novella. I think I'd like that to exist in print form. I also have a more Midwestern realist novel in mind that I've started to sketch out, which I'm thinking of setting in the late 80s, early 90s. And it's going to be about these small town stone mill or quarrymen, that kind of like working class life. And that will be actually a little bit of an homage to Dostoyevsky and Crime and Punishment, because there's going to be a violent act which is not sensationalized, but then is the launching pad for this moral exploration. Like a violent conflict over a sexual jealousy, which is also a perennial issue.
And it will lead to a blooming of Eastern Orthodoxy.
Yeah, well, very possibly, yeah. that is somewhat what I have in mind.
Look, if you're not too sick of podcasts, if or when you publish those things, love to have you on again to talk.
Oh yeah, no, I'm sure. I think enough time will elapse between not too much time, but enough to where, yeah, I'll be ready for another round.
So, in publishing these things, so you're getting published at the moment by Bonfire Books, and from what it sounds like, they've been really, really great. What's the sort of landscape you see in general for people who are particularly those starting out with publication, starting out with writing, has it changed over the past few years? Do you see it changing in the future? Will things like, say, Substack or podcast become more important, or is that a wave that's petering out post-COVID? How do you see the landscape?
Yeah, I think it's already changed even in the last 5 years or so, 5 or 6 years. And it's not when I first started writing, but when I first tried to promote my writing and try to find a deal with someone, Twitter, I think, had more potential. It was easier to get some attention on Twitter. The game was very different. The algorithms were different. It was under different ownership. Things are much more restricted now. And I wouldn't know what to tell someone who is just now getting on Twitter. Substack is a little bit more recent, and even there, I think you're better off. Hopefully, you already made some kind of name for yourself or have some footing. Just starting now, I'm not sure what to tell people because the saturation is getting worse, and I think that's only going to get worse. Now, your only hope is to use something like Substack, maybe Twitter, some social media platform, but I think it's going to get more and more saturated, and it's going to become quickly more and more difficult. If you don't already have some sort of footing, it's going to get tougher and tougher to get one. And I don't even know what to do myself necessarily. I got incredibly lucky with the deals that I've made and the people I've met, and I'm not in some comfortable position by any means. I mean, I'm comfortable in a very limited sense where I have people I know I can work with. They can put out what I want to do, but the reach is still very, very limited. And for people who are even farther down than I am, yeah, I don't know what to tell you. Good luck, but it's not necessarily a promising situation.
Look, for authors who are interested in someone talking about their work, please write into this podcast. Want to have more authors on here.
Right. Do podcasts, reach out to people. I would do if I meet someone whose work that I like and I could help them, I would, but there's not a whole lot I can do. I mean, I can make posts, I can recommend one person to another, but that's just, you need a certain patience. You need to be willing to toil in obscurity because I'm still facing all of these obstacles. There's not a whole lot I can do for others. And I don't expect that there's a lot that other people can do for me, although still certain connections are worth making. It's not completely futile, but it's certainly an uphill battle. You have to be prepared for that.
Yeah. So we'll be drawing to a close with this episode also because I'm aware that you don't have unlimited stamina. You probably have other things you're doing each day. So
it seems like about the right time.
Yeah, so there are probably two questions remaining. One, so from this book, you're talking about the gym a lot. You mentioned you had like a 500-pound plus deadlift. Is that true?
Yeah, well, it used to be. It's not true.
That's a good pull.
It's not true anymore. I went through a phase where I was extremely diligent about training and eating.
What's that in kilos? 500 pounds.
I don't know the conversion of that.
So 500 pounds, 226 kilos. Yeah, that's a really nice pull.
So
is that conventional or sumo?
Conventional.
Nice.
I'm actually stronger conventional because of my body composition. I have long arms and I don't know, I've
got bench press arms, so I just get fucked on conventional.
Yeah, see,
I do much better in the pretend it doesn't count form of deadlifting, which is sumo.
Yeah, well, my bench press was always shit because of long arms, and yeah, deadlift was always my strong point, and there was a period of a couple of years where I really was disciplined and consistent in how I trained for that and worked up to it, ate a certain way, and I probably pulled 500 maybe 2 or 3 times. It wasn't even as if I coasted for a long period of time on that. And then I have gradually lost interest in powerlifting like that. And I really don't...
Blowing out your intervertebral discs.
Yeah, I started to feel like that might be more and more of a possibility, and it wasn't worth it. And I know this might sound, especially with the way I was before, but I do way more cardio now. I mostly run and jump rope and do body weight exercises.
But yes, that was one of the biggest takeaways from hardly working when you chucked your deadlift numbers in there.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a vestige of sorts, and I have a deeper jock background as well. I played football in high school, and the place I grew up was much more sport oriented than academic. That was the academic stuff came a little bit later and was much more idiosyncratic. My family is much more into physical culture.
Yeah, look, this is a huge topic that you probably don't have time now to get into, but the role of embodiment or existing or recognizing your existence as an embodied being is much more important for art than I think a lot of people acknowledge.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so last question, once again, shilling as much as you love doing it. What are the things that you want people to be aware of coming away from this podcast? I'll stick all of these things in the show notes.
Yeah, okay. There's The Neighbor, which is a novel, Novelty and Other Stories, short story collection, and Hardly Working, which we can call it a novel, autofiction. It's a collection of vignettes. I think I called them at one point vinaigrettes, vinegar charged bitter episodes. And then Middle American Literature is the Substack channel, and I am pretty consistent with it, although I always reserve the right to completely fuck off and not put anything up there for however long. But I do like to stay somewhat consistent with it, and some of that material is very similar to what's in Hardly Working, but there are some departures too. I get into more theoretical territory as well. I do stuff that's a little bit loftier.
Great. Well, thanks so much for coming on. It was a real pleasure to chat with you.
Yeah, you as well. Thank you for having me.